morning, everyone. The first thing I'm going to do is test. I have two remotes because we're trying to cover this ground. So usually I just have to do it in my classroom, like right here. It's not an issue. So we're on the big stage now, so we're going to check and see. Yep, okay, we got coverage with the East Oakland version. We don't need the high-tech version. I just want to start by thanking Christy and her team because, as the intro mentioned, I'm on the national lecture circuit and am regularly being asked by folks to come and give keynotes. And a lot of those organizations that are bringing me out are organizations that, at least in their mission statement, claim to be interested in supporting youth and families, as you all are. But when it comes down to the business of getting me there as the keynote, their interest in me being a father tends to radically decrease. And so when I tell them that I have twin boys, my wife is a lawyer and a full-time working professional, and I want to sleep with my sons before I come to do the talk, then folks aren't always all that responsive. And Christy's team was. They bent over backwards to, because I have to stay. I don't like staying overnight anywhere. Just generally speaking, but especially now as a father. And I have to stay overnight tonight in this area because I'm doing a keynote for Riverside County schools tomorrow. And so it was looking like I had to do back-to-back overnights, which is, not a good look if you're married. And then your wife has to stay with the two kids, but also because I love being with my sons. And Christy bent over backwards to make it possible for me to sleep with my family last night and then fly in early this morning, get picked up from the airport and get here. And so I'm just really appreciative that the mission of this organization isn't just rhetoric, that the ways in which folks operate and engage with people is really about supporting fathers. Because that's what it means to support kids too, right? Is to support the parents and the families of those kids. So thank you for allowing me to start a little bit late today so I could be with my sons last night. The talk that I'm going to do today is actually based on an article that I wrote for the Harvard Ed Review a few years back. So if there's stuff that comes up during the talk that is useful for your work that you want to access, you can Google search my name in this same title. This is the title of the article. And almost certainly find a PDF copy of it and download it. For any reason you can't, my email is on this opening slide. And you can email me and I'll be happy to violate my publishing contract with Harvard and send it to you. So, I'm the youngest of 7 kids. And as the youngest, I often felt like it was my birthright to complain about pretty much everything. And I remember one time I come in the house and I'm ranting and raving about something, and my mother stops me in the middle of my rant. And she points at the kitchen table and she says, "Sit down." She goes in the kitchen and she takes a glass and she fills it halfway with water. And she comes back and she sets the glass between us and she sits down and she points at the glass and says, "Half full or half empty?" And my mom's was good for those kind of trick questions where there is no right answer, so whatever answer you give is the wrong answer, and that's the lesson you need right now. And so I just stared back blankly. I didn't take the bait, and she says, "Son, how you choose to answer that question is how you will live your life. Because your life will always be both half full and half empty. And if you choose to see your life as half empty, if you choose to see your life for all the things that you don't have, you will never fill your cup. But if you can see your life as half full, if you can see your life for the things that you do have, you will fill your cup, it will overflow, and you can share that with others." Now this is precisely what I think that Tupac Shakur means when he talks about young people growing up in urban poverty as the roses that grow from concrete. And can I see I need to see the slide deck to make sure. Okay, cool. Now, you can come down wherever you want on Tupac. Right? Cornel West says, no one free of spot or wrinkle. Right? And I agree. I think Tupac deserves to be critiqued for some of the things that he said, some of the things that he did, some of the ways that he lived his life. But who doesn't? But what is undeniable to me, in all those hats that I wear that you heard in the introduction, right? As a father, as a community member in East Oakland, as a veteran classroom teacher of over 20 years, as a researcher, I challenge you to find anybody in late modernity that has had the power to reach and teach across all the lines that we say we want to cross with young people: race, class, gender, political boundaries. That Tupac Shakur has had. Tupac was killed in 1986. Okay? And yet, young people continue, the young people that y'all work with, continue to listen to his work. Many of y'all came into the conference this morning listening to Tupac. Don't lie. I know you got at least one Pac song on your iPhone. Okay? Cats outing themselves right now, clapping back there. Yeah, I got 5. I got albums. And so, 10 years ago, I got invited to come to New Zealand to do some work with the Maori community in New Zealand. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the indigenous politic of the globe, the Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. And so they asked me to come out there and do some work with Maori youth and schools serving Maori youth. And so my first meeting, when I get, let me just kind of ground this for you. So I'm from the 3400 block of East Oakland. So if you take a pin and you drop it on my block, okay, and then you take a pin, okay, and you drop it on a map of the world in Otara, okay, which is the community just outside of Auckland where I was working with Maori youth. Okay, it is literally the other side of the world. Okay, so I'm not being hyperbolic here when I say I was on the other side of the world. Okay? And my first meeting is with a group of 30 high school Maori youth. And I walk in the room, and this one young brother hops up, and he runs up to me, and he's like, "You're from Oakland?" I was like, "Yeah." He says, "Did you know Tupac?" I was like, "Nah, Brian, I've never been to Oakland. We know each other like that." But it was so profound to me that I was all the way across the world, and the first question out of a young person's mouth is about Tupac. I can tell you, as a classroom teacher of English literature for 20 years, that I can take a crisp $100 bill and stick it inside of any Shakespearean text and leave that text anywhere in my classroom, and it is perfectly safe. But if I leave this book out, and the title of this slide is actually the title of Tupac's book of poetry. A lot of folks don't know that Pac wrote a book of poetry. Okay? But I can tell you, as a literature teacher, that if I leave this book out anywhere in my classroom, it is immediately snatched up by kids. And immediately snatched up by the very same kids that the system is convinced are not interested in literacy. Mm-hmm. And what I tell principals and superintendents and teachers all the time is it's not that kids aren't interested in literacy. It's that they're not interested in the literacy you're giving them. Okay? And these are two different problems. Okay? Now, as I said, you can come down anywhere you want on Pac, right? But what is undeniable to me, right, is that there is something in Tupac's message that is resonating with our young people, okay? And it is resonating the most profoundly with the young people we are struggling the most to reach. And so as a teacher, as a father, as a researcher, I wanted to understand, what is it about Tupac's message that has been so transcendent for so many youth? And how do I distill that out, okay, and make that a central part of my practice and work with young people, okay, so that I can have that same kind of resonating message with the young people that I'm most interested in reaching? And so to frame that up, to frame what it is that I think Tupac is saying that is resonating so profoundly with young people, I'm going to play a clip from him reading this poem. And he actually reads this poem. The title of the book is probably his best-known poem. Okay? And he actually reads this poem on multiple tracks. The one that is the best known is a song called Mama's Just a Little Girl. Okay? And at the end of that song, over the beat of the song, he reads this poem. And I'm gonna play him reading this poem as a way to frame up the conversation that I want to have with you all today.
To ask us why we turn from bad to worse is to ignore from which we came. Mama's just a little girl. You wouldn't ask why the rose that grew from the concrete had damaged petals. On the contrary, we would all celebrate its tenacity. We would all love its will to reach the sun. Well, we are the roses. We are the roses. This is the concrete. This is the concrete. And these are my damaged petals. These are my damaged. Don't ask me why. Don't ask why. Thank God. Thank God. Ask me how.
Now, what Tupac is saying here is precisely the same thing that my mother said to me. What Pac is pointing out is how absurd it would be if you and the homie are walking down the street and the homie sees a rose growing in the concrete and says, "Oh, a rose in the concrete." And you're like, "Yo, yeah, that's amazing." And the homie looks back to you and says, "Yeah, but what a shame. It's got damaged petals." And you would turn to that homie and say, "Of course it has damaged petals, fool. It's growing in the concrete." But we do this all the time with young people. We question their damaged petals instead of celebrating their tenacity and their will to reach the sun. We constantly see young people as glasses half empty instead of as glasses half full. And the reason why Tupac's message resonates so profoundly with young people that have such profound damaged petals is because he says to them, "I see you. I see your tenacity and your will to reach the sun. And I embrace your damaged petals." I have damaged petals. I wear them in ink on my arms so that every morning when I get out the shower, I am reminded of who I am and where I come from. But school constantly told me that they wanted me to leave that ink at the door. They wanted me to come in and just be compliant and nice. But my life wasn't nice. What was happening in the streets, what was happening at home was not nice. And so I was looking for something bigger than myself when I came to these adults who said they cared about me, but they didn't want to hear about all that. They wanted it to be convenient and easy. And I was looking for a way to communicate to them that I need you to see this ink on my arm. I need you to see my damaged petals so that you can see my tenacity and my will to reach the sun. Everyone in this room is a glass half full and a glass half empty. Every kid that we work with is a glass half full and a glass half empty. That is not the choice. The choice is how will we as adults choose to see those young people? And you know in your life that the people who see you as half empty, the people who see you for the things that you don't have, you don't fill up for them. You try to spend as little time with them as possible. But the people who see you as half full, the people who see you for your assets, you want time with them, okay? And you work to fill up for them. And ultimately, that is why Pac's message is resonating so profoundly with young people. Now, Pac is quite right that the concrete is real, and it has real impacts on the bodies and the lives of young people. And if we're really going to serve the cities, the counties, the nations, the globe's most vulnerable youth, we've got to understand the concrete better. Nothing that I've read, no experts that I've met with, no lectures I've been to has more profoundly impacted my day-to-day practice with young people in my community than this film series. It is a 6-part film series from PBS called Unnatural Causes. It has a phenomenal website with tons of resources for teachers, for youth advocates, for youth development workers. It is a global study of the question underneath the title, is inequality making us sick? Short answer? Yes. Okay. The biggest threat to health on the planet is inequality. If we want a healthier city, a healthier community, a healthier state, a healthier nation, that should be the primary point of attack, okay, is reducing inequality. Now, the concrete in the metaphor reveals to us just how toxic, okay, it is to try and grow in the concrete. Okay? And yet life seems to always find a way up through the cracks. Right? But the cracks are limited. And so the better that we understand the concrete, the better that we understand the multi-layers of toxicity that the concrete creates in young people's lives, the more likely we can bust up that concrete and create more space for them to grow. Okay? Now, I cannot tell you which of these bullets should be the starting point for this community. Okay? That's your job. Okay? I know where we need to start in my community. Right. What I can tell you, okay, is that all of these layers of the concrete that are listed here are impacting the lives of young people in profound ways. And the medical research on these things and how they are impacting young people, okay, is profound. Okay, so I have this sort of obligatory academic parenthetical citations after each of these because I want to make it clear to you, okay, that the science is clear. Okay, the body of research coming out of social epidemiology, public health, the medical field, neuroscience is crystal clear. Okay, that if we don't address these things in the lives of young people, then we're just playing games. Okay, we're just forming up programs. We're not actually serious about creating the conditions of health, okay, that lead to long-term sustained outcomes for kids, that allow them to be so-called productive citizens in our society. So, the one that I'm going to highlight is the one that is probably the most profoundly impactful in the community where I live, and that's physical violence. In 2006, the San Francisco Chronicle called itself so concerned with homicide in our community that they started mapping it. And they said that we have the plague, which I find interesting because, as I said, I live on a 3400 block of East Oakland, and if you look at this map, I live right in the heart of the plague. And if we had the plague, guess what? Y'all would be in trouble right now. Because the plague's the ultimate non-discriminator, isn't it? It doesn't recognize race, doesn't recognize class, doesn't recognize gender, and it certainly doesn't recognize political boundaries. But those red lines that just pop up are the city boundaries of Oakland. And as you can see, this plague has been almost perfectly quarantined between the 580 and the 880 freeways, in that one strip right in the middle of the city. And you don't have to be a topographical genius to look at this map and see the outlier. Right. What is it? Piedmont. What the hell is going on in Piedmont where they can completely opt out of the plague? Cornel West jokes that Disneyland brags nobody's ever died in their premises. He says, somebody probably has, they just push them across the line and keep their record clean. And that's what I think is going on with that dot that's right up there on that green line. That shit was probably in Piedmont. They're like, oh, no, we don't have homicide here. Get that back to Oakland, right? One more, they won't care. 5 years, 555 homicides in a city of a little over 400,000 people. In 2007, the Chronicle gave up, and the Oakland Tribune started mapping homicides. They put the faces and the names and the places of everybody who was murdered in our city on the front page of the Oakland Tribune every year. These are the 4 most recent homicide maps, and as you can see, there has been almost no stemming of the tide. So I decided that I would update the homicide map. And I'm going to do that for 13 years. Because that's how many years young people are actually in public school in our community. This is 9 years, y'all. This kid has just come to my 9th grade English class. And you tell me, where can a young person live in our community where they have not personally witnessed homicide, if not multiple homicides? And yet the conversation in school is virtually unattentive to this. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, we don't have this kind of homicide problem in Riverside. Okay? Perhaps not. Okay? But the great thing about GIS mapping is you can map any of the toxic stressors in this same way. So any of the things that were in that concrete list that are affecting the kids in your community, you can create these kinds of neighborhood maps to understand what is actually affecting kids before they get to us. And then develop strategies that are actually, instead of generally responsive to, well, we're working with immigrant youth, or we're working with Latino youth, or we're working with black youth, to actually get onto the ground and ground truth the realities of the kids you're trying to support, and then become responsive in that way. What we know from the research is that exposure to this kind of toxic stress causes PTSD. And the problem with the conversation about PTSD is that it's mostly focused on this dude, which is right because soldiers are particularly prone to PTSD. But nobody's talking about these brothers. These are my students. This is me on the camera. This is us burying another one of my students. A 16-year-old stabbed more than a dozen times in the face with a screwdriver, about 6 blocks from my house. And this is who buried him. This is who went to the funeral. And the next day, we're back at school. And what's the conversation in school about? Y'all don't ever spend any time in school. How y'all going to support young people who don't spend any time in schools? What's the conversation in schools about?
You should pay back.
Tests, Common Core, rigorous instruction, A through G, college going, college and career pathways, college and career ready. All of which matter. But not in that context. In that context, that's what matters first. And if you're not going to address this, then you can't tell me that you care about me. And we already know that. That's the part that frustrates me, is that we know better. And we have hard evidence in this country that we know better. I'll give you one example of many. Columbine. What happens in Columbine, Colorado, after these conditions impact a predominantly white, wealthy community? What is the response? Can you even imagine a situation in Columbine, Colorado, where after those shootings, those kids come back to Columbine High School and teachers come out their mouth with, what do you mean you didn't do your homework? Where's your backpack? We got to get to the rigor, kids, because you're not going to be college and career ready. Are you serious about school? I mean, it's laughable. Some of you are actually laughing because it is laughable in this country to think that we would treat wealthy white children in that way. And yet we treat poor and working class children, regardless of race, in that way, particularly black and brown youth. And I don't want to say that this only happens to black and brown youth, because all you got to do is go to the Appalachians, where you have multi-generational entrenched white poverty, and you see the same thing. An obtuse, morally suspect response to the material conditions of kids' lives. And then we wonder why kids reject school. Wealthy white kids would reject school in Columbine too, if they had come back. And the response from the adults in those buildings was, get to work. But that isn't the response. Okay? Instead, it's, let me start with your humanity. Because in you, I can see myself. Okay? The truth of the matter is that in this nation, the suffering of some people matters less than the suffering of others. And until we wrap our heads around that, then we really are just playing games. And the kids that are most experiencing that inequality are going to continue to reject the rhetorical offerings of the institutions that aim to serve them. Now, all the stuff I've read, nothing has better equipped me to figure out how to read the signs of trauma in the young people I serve and how to respond appropriately than this book. Okay? This book is written by a dude named Bruce Perry, who is considered the nation's leading expert on child trauma. Okay? This is really the dude that should be up here keynoting this conference. So get him for year 29. Okay? And then I'll ask Bruce for a 15% booking fee. This book is chapter by chapter, is a case study of individual kids or groups of kids that Bruce has worked with as a medical doctor that have experienced high levels of trauma. And I cannot tell you how profoundly important this book has been for me in working with traumatized youth. Because Bruce's responses are so pragmatic, but also the way in which he narrates how young people manifest trauma in their actions is so helpful for me, because it allows me to read behavior differently. So much of my training as a teacher is to read kids, quote unquote, acting up as misbehavior, right? And then what's offered to me as a teacher is a punishment cycle, right? And what Perry does, right, is he unearths for you to begin to realize, okay, if you know this is going on in this kid's life, the likelihood that it manifests in ways that are self-destructive are pretty likely. And here's some really obvious ways that kids will try to communicate that to you, because kids are not going to be able to come, right, and necessarily explain their trauma to you. If you can read the signs, right, then your response can be much more caring and responsive to what's happening in their life than just sort of jumping, right, the leap in logic to, well, you're just misbehaving, right? You need some discipline, right, or some tough love, or however it is that we rationalize, right, not treating kids with loving gloves. Here's what the research says. Okay? 1 in 3 urban youth display the symptoms of mild to severe PTSD. 1 in 3. When they ran that data against the Pentagon's data, what they found is urban youth are actually twice as likely as a soldier returning from live combat to have PTSD. In 2011, Harvard School of Public Health said, actually, what we're seeing in young people experiencing toxic stress is more complex than what we see in soldiers. And the explanation they gave for that is that, what does PTSD stand for, y'all? Right, post-traumatic stress, which makes sense for a soldier because a soldier leaves the battlefield. But what about young people? Right, they're constantly going back into it. And so in 2011, Harvard School of Public Health released a completely new diagnosis to describe what they're seeing in young people that are having recurring experiences with trauma. And they're saying that what they're seeing in their bodies, what they're seeing going on in their brains, is more complex than what they see in soldiers that have come back from live combat. And the reason for this is that, well, Tupac's right. Okay, so you can either read Bruce Perry and neuroscience, or you can just listen to Tupac, right? It all gets you to the same place. Right? And Pac is quite right, that exposure to the concrete causes damaged petals. Right? David Williams at Harvard School of Public Health says, what we need to keep track of is the accumulation of multiple negative stressors without the resources to cope. That's your money piece. Okay? Those are the kids that are struggling the most in your city and county right now. Multiple negative stressors, no resources to cope. Right? Now you have to front load that response. In order to really get the right resources to kids, what do you have to know? Right, what are the negative stressors, okay, in that kid's life? Right? And then the resources are actually allowing them to cope with those stressors. The reason that this is so toxic to the body is because when you have these multiple negative stressors and nothing in your life is really resourcing you to respond, your allostatic load gets elevated. Right? This is a term that everybody working with youth living in trauma should be conversant in. This is straight out of a medical journal. Okay? And this is what allostatic load looks like in the body. right, at the top graph that you see, right, is a normal stress event. Right, so let me just be clear with everybody in this room right now, right, that I am not advocating that you or the children that you serve aim to have a stress-free life. Okay? That is not what I am saying. There is only one group of people on the planet that have a stress-free life. Somebody, she muffled it right away, right? Dead people. Right? So if you want a stress-free life, right. Stress is a natural part of the human condition, right? And it's actually good for your body. Right? In a normal stress event, okay, it looks like the top graph that you see. Right? So I'll give you an example from my own life, okay, of a stressor, right, and how it impacted my body. Okay? So I'll tell you about the first time that I tried to ask the person that is now my wife out. So, you know, people joke with my wife all the time. They're like, don't you stress out because he's traveling all over the world and he's staying in hotels and he's meeting all these single people? And she goes, no. I'm like, why not? She says, because he has no game. Which is totally true. So my no game ass is over here, right, trying to think about how I'm going to talk to this incredibly beautiful, talented, amazing woman, and I'm sitting over here in the corner trying to pump myself up, saying stuff like, your mom says you're handsome, your mom says you're handsome, your mom says you're handsome. And I start going across the room to try to talk to her, and what is happening to my chest?
Pounding.
It's pounding, right? And that is the uptick on that graph that you see at the top. Okay? So the stressor moment enters my life, okay? And my stress response system automatically kicks in.
Yeah.
Okay? This is important to know, right? When you are experiencing stressors in your life, do you control your body's response?
No.
No. Okay? It is automatic. In fact, medical doctors say that the stress response system is perhaps the most sophisticated, okay, and domineering response system in the body. Okay? It is immediate, it is rapid, and it shuts everything else down. Okay? You get back into your reptilian brain, right? And they say, right, that you have the F cubed, right, becomes your options. The 3 Fs, what are they? Right. Fight, flight, or freeze. Okay? Everything else shuts down. Okay? In order for you to survive this stress moment. And this is why, as I'm walking across to my wife, this is why, for some people in this room, okay, when your local PD pull up behind you, right, your whole body changes. Okay? I mean, when OPD pulls up behind me, okay, I literally forget how to drive. I mean, I'm not making this up. I start doing hand signals to turn. I look down at my speedometer, I'm like, oh shit, I'm going 5 miles an hour. And some people in this room are like, I don't understand. Like when Jimmy pulls up behind me, I just say, hey Jimmy, how's it going? The interaction with police is not the same for everybody in this society, right? So understand that different stressors impact different people. For the men in this room, when the sun goes down and you walk into your car, not a big stressor. For the most part, depending on which hood you live in, but right, generally speaking, okay? But for women, this is always a stressor. Okay? If they're walking, so just be clear about the fact, right, that stressors are in different people's bodies for different reasons. Okay? And so I'm walking over to talk to my wife, and my heart is pounding. Okay? And there's other things that are happening when you start learning how to read the signs of stress. You can start seeing it in people's bodies.
Wow.
Okay? And so the reason my heart starts pounding, the reason that my forearms tighten up, the reason that my jawline tightens up, is because all these chemicals are rushing into my body to allow me to deal with this stress moment. Okay, the one that you'll probably be the most familiar with is adrenaline. All right? The one that the medical field is the most concerned with is a chemical called cortisol. And everyone in this room, okay, should know about cortisol. Because the medical field has been able to directly link the overproduction of cortisol with the 4 biggest unnatural killers in this society.
Wow.
Cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension. All of which disproportionately affect poor people and people of color. Because we have additional toxic stressors in our life, no matter how educated we are, no matter what zip code we live in, no matter how much money we make, no matter how many resources we have, right? We have additional stressors. Okay? So I get over to my wife, heart is pounding, cortisol, adrenaline, all these things running through my body. Okay? And I start trying to talk to her. I don't even remember what I said. Okay? I try to get her number, and she says, no, I won't give you my number, but I will take yours. Now let me just tell all the folks in the room that think you have game, that I later learned is actually the brush off. I was juiced. I was like, she took my number, right? And then my homies were like, dude, that just means she wanted you to get out of there. But it worked out okay. We married. We got twins now. Thanks. So I give her my number. I walk away. What's going on inside my chest? Back to normal? No, right? But starting to, right? And that's what, on the second side of the graph, you see the medical field referred to as the recovery period, right? And you'll see it's a nice, slow, gentle slope where the adrenaline and the cortisol and all these other chemicals, right, slowly go back down to normal levels in your body. That is a normal stress even. That is actually good for your body. But that is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the bottom 4 graphs. Toxic stress. I joke with teachers all the time about this one. Because for kids, it's kind of like this. First period, second period, third period, fourth period, fifth period. And let me just say, any teachers in the room? Okay, so y'all know, for us, it's kind of like this. First period, second period, third period, fourth period. What do you notice about the graph that is circled versus the graph at the top? What do you notice about the slope? It's steeper. On which side? That's what kills you. This is what happens when you're bouncing stressor to stressor to stressor to stressor. Okay? It is a radical influx of those chemicals in the body and no recovery period because you're just bouncing on to the next stressor. Right? And eventually, if that happens enough, if you've got multiple negative stressors in your life and no resources to slow it down, then you move over to the second bar where you start getting maladaptation. And you start seeing, right, the graph isn't as smooth. Right? And then you move into the third bar, okay, where you are constantly at the peak of your stress response system. There is no recovery period. This is the kid who is hypervigilant. This is the kid who, if you get in his space at all, could explode. Okay? Because he is on maximum overload. She is on maximum overload. Okay? And eventually, if you stay there long enough, you end in the bottom category, okay, where you flatline. And you literally can't even muster a response anymore. Your body is so exhausted. Okay? This is the kid that is constantly falling asleep in class. Okay? Just physically not capable, right, of staying alert anymore because their body has just worn itself down trying to respond to all the stressors in their life. The best research I've seen to describe how this is impacting the body comes from Arlene Geronimus, who is a presidential professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And, you know, you can look at Arlene's work. It's pretty high-end medical research. I don't pretend to understand it all. But this particular issue of Miller McCune, which you can get online for free, gives a great summary of about 2 decades of her work and how it's changed the conversation in the field. And the reason I really respect Arlene's work is because, you know, a lot of my colleagues in the academy spend a lot of time doing research trying to isolate individual causal or effects. And what Arlene says is that in this work, that doesn't make sense. Because that's not how society works. Society isn't just an issue of you're being impacted by race, or you're being impacted by gender, or you're being impacted by poverty, or you're being impacted by immigration status, or you're being impacted by language, or you're being... Society is an intersection of all those things. They're all at play all the time. And so Arlene said, I wonder what would happen if we started running these stress studies, looking at the lives of people who have multiple intersecting stressors. And so she started studying the lives of black women that were living in poverty. 3 of the biggest stressors: race, gender, poverty. And what she found is that the stacking of multiple stressors literally weathers the body. Okay? This is the term she saw weathering, okay, in the inner workings of these women's bodies. And the way that I describe it is, it's like if you're poor and or a person of color, you are born into a fight in this country. You don't want to be in a fight. You want peace. Okay? But the fight is on your doorstep from Jump Street. Okay? And the body is incredibly resilient. So it fights back against those stressors. And the problem with the way in which we think about this is that most folks think about these stressors like you're fighting Mike Tyson. Okay? But you're not fighting Mike Tyson, because if you fought Mike Tyson, what would happen? Okay, yeah. Somebody over there goes, you get your ear bit. Right, and then you get knocked out. Okay? But you're not fighting Mike Tyson. Okay? You're fighting a true master of the sweet science, a pure pugilist. And have you ever been in a fight before? And I'm talking about, like, it ain't no getting out of it, right? It's gonna hop off, you can't run, you cannot hide, you gonna have to chuck them. And so you know you gotta square, so you start squaring up your hands. What do you protect? Your head. You protect your face, you protect your head, because that's where the knockouts happen, right? So you know you're gonna have to, so you get your hands up, and where do they go to work? Okay, they go to work on the body. But that's okay, because you work out at 24-hour fitness and tell yourself you got your, whatever you tell yourself you got down there, 6-pack, 8-pack, 12-pack, okay? And so they go to work on the body, right? Body blow after body blow after body blow. But because your body is so resilient, okay, it takes those body blows. It's not a knockout blow. But the way that most people are talking about racism in this country is as though it's some mega event. White folks on a white horse show up on your lawn and light a white cross on fire. And everybody's like, that's racist. Okay? And indeed it is. And let's not pretend that doesn't still happen in certain parts of this country, because it does. But that's not how racism operates anymore. That's not how patriarchy operates anymore. It's much more structural and insidious. Sociologists refer to the ways in which these inequalities are operating now as microaggressions. Understand that term. Okay? Microaggressions are the body blows, okay, that by themselves, okay, are not going to kill you. By themselves are not going to spike your stress meter. Okay? Microaggressions are things like you walking down the street and police roll by you and stop and roll down their window and just take that extra glance. Or do that stop and frisk. Or you standing in the elevator and some folks walk up and go, oh, that's all right, we'll get the next one. And the door's closed and you look around like, what the hell, ain't nobody else in this elevator? Or people say to you as a student, right, you're so articulate. That's an amazing paper. Did you write that? And over the course of your life, right, any of those individual events, not that big of a deal. But have that happening to you over and over and over and over again. Day after day after day. Body blow after body blow after body blow. What eventually happens to your hands?
They come down.
They come down. And then what happens?
You get beat up.
And then you get cancer. And then you get type 2 diabetes. Then you get hypertension. Then you get heart disease. And this is the problem with the conversation about stress, is that kids are not going to come to us with a little meter around their neck that says, my allostatic load is currently 7.6, please back down. And so we have to learn how to read the signs of kids who are getting all these microaggressions in their life, okay? And they're coming in with peaking allostatic loads, and figure out, how do we de-escalate? Okay? How do we become that interrupting force, that resource that allows you that recovery period to begin to get back to who you naturally are as a human being? So typically this is where people are at this point in the talk. What the? Why did they bring this dude? We're trying to be on an up note. We're trying to be positive today. You brought the stress, dude. I got stress now. My mother's 83 years old, and she has recently discovered email, which means that I get regular updates on Jesus. I know when he's risen, I know when he's dead, I know when there's 2 sets of footprints in the sand and there's only one, and I know what my role is in that. And one of my brothers found out that I did this talk at Harvard a few years back, and it was me and Artie Duncan were the 2 keynotes. And Artie Duncan went on first, and then I went on after him and explained why everything he said was wrong. And so Harvard makes a big deal of it, and they videotape it, and they put it on YouTube. And so my brother gets the YouTube link and emails it to my mom. My mom calls me up. It's like, yeah, son, your brother just sent me the YouTube link to your Harvard talk. I'm going to go on, I'm going to watch it, and then I'm going to call you back and let you know what I think. I was like, all right, cool, Mom. So about 80 minutes later, my mom calls me back. I said, what'd you think, Mom? She says, I think you curse too much. Good thing about my mom, though, is she does not text message. And if you don't know what that means at the top of that slide, don't worry about it, it's not important. What is important is that we are not screwed at all. Actually, the medical research is crystal clear about what to do to support young people that are experiencing toxic stress. And in fact, in the last decade, the science is profoundly conclusive. And what the science is showing us is that the single biggest protective factor in a young person's life that is experiencing toxic stress is a caring adult. Okay, now let me just be clear, right, what the science tells us. Okay? Not a licensed therapist caring adult. Not a licensed credentialed teacher caring adult. Right? A caring adult, period. Which is why every adult in the community is so important to this work that we do. Okay? We gotta stop siloing it into these licensure, right? You deserve to work with young people. You're not quite qualified. That is not what the science says. The science says it can be any adult in a kid's life, okay, that de-escalates, okay, and begins the healing process. Okay? And we can't always choose who those adults are going to be. Kids are the ones that select the adults that they believe, okay, are really committed to healing and caring about them. And we have to be attentive to that to make sure that those young people who are the most in need have access to those adults. The research also shows that there's a one-to-one correlation. You don't find this often in the research. There's a one-to-one correlation between how effectively a young person navigates toxic stress and how many caring adults they have. Okay? So if you start stacking caring adults, right, the more caring adults, okay, the research is clear, the more caring adults, right, the more likely that young person successfully navigates the stress in their life. And the reason for this is, what the research is bearing out, is that the more caring adults young people have in their lives, the higher their hope levels. Okay? Wow. The medical field is actually working now to measure hope in the body. Wow. Now, I like the word hope because, as I said, I'm an English teacher, and if you look the word up in a dictionary, you'll find that it's both a noun and a verb, which means hope is a dynamic word. It's both a thing and an action. And as I said, more and more researchers are turning their attention to hope in the lives of young people that are experiencing toxic stress. My favorites are the work of Charles Schneider in the field of psychology. He developed something called hope theory. And the ways in which he's measuring hope is through something he developed called the Children's Hope Scale. I actually use the Children's Hope Scale in our program in East Oakland to measure hope levels when kids first start working with us, and then to track the impact on their hope levels that we have over time. And my favorite definition of hope comes from a social epidemiologist in Berkeley's School of Public Health, a dude named Lynn Syme. And he defines hope as a sense of control of destiny. Now, I don't know why y'all got into this work. I don't know why you're in the children's network. But that's why I got into this work. I got into youth work in my community because I wanted to give young people a greater sense of control over their own destiny. And what this research has uncovered for me is that the reason I got into this work is to peddle hope. Because hope is control of your own destiny. Now, the more I've looked at this research, the more I've done this work, the more I've realized that I'm not on to anything new. That I am really returning to my own ancestral teachings. And the problem in this country is that we are profoundly ahistorical. We act as though history began in 1776. Most people in this room don't even know their true indigeneity. They don't know their indigenous land. They don't know their indigenous language. They don't know the teachings of their ancestors. But I promise you that if you do that work on yourself, if you really trace back to who you really are, who are your original ancestors, what is your indigenous land, what is your indigenous language, what were the practices there that are flowing in your sangre now, that are in the marrow of your bones, I promise you that you will find the same thing that I find when I trace back to my first ancestors. My people are from the Mayan and the Mexica. And the Mayans taught all their children one core principle. And it became highly popularized in the last 5 years or so because of the work of the Raza Studies program in Tucson Unified, which used the principle of In La Quech, the core Mayan principle, as the core of their program in their work with young people in Tucson. And In La Quech is a story that we would tell our children, and it was the story of the smoking mirror. And the moral of the story is this: that every living being you come across is a smoking mirror, son. This is what I tell my sons. Tayari, Amaru. Every living being that you come across is a smoking mirror. That is not the question. The question is whether or not you will muster up the courage, character, and commitment to clear the smoke away. Because if you do, what will you see? You will see yourself. Now, I've been teaching a long time, and sometimes there is way more smoke between me and a kid than other times. And there are times when I can actually name where that smoke came from. But that is not the question. What I have had to come to terms with as a teacher in my community is that the more smoke, the more they need me. The harder I gotta work, the harder it's going to be. And the more important that work is in that moment, because if I don't get through the smoke, it's going to be even more smoke tomorrow. But if I can clear that smoke away, and I can see myself, then the path forward will always be one that is deeply rooted in love and care and connection. But if you cannot see yourself in the children you serve, you will always rationalize why you can't. But you never rationalize about your own children. Because how many of you in here are parents? Right, so you already know the deal. Right, what's the playbook that you're working off of? Right, there ain't one. Right? And the minute you think you got one, the plays change. And so you know, especially if you have multiple kids, right, that what works with Amaru isn't necessarily going to work with Tayari. Sometimes it does, and that's jackpot. Okay? But sometimes it doesn't. And you can't just look at Tayari and be like, what's wrong with you, son? You're twins. You should do exactly what he does. You got to figure out what Tayari needs in that moment or what Amaru needs in that moment. It is no different than when you work with the children that are not directly connected to your family tree. You got to figure out first what they need, and then develop the path forward. Now, the way that we try to do this in our community is really through a commitment to these three strands that together produce what we call critical hope. Now, critical hope is a trifecta. And I call it a trifecta. If you're a betting person, you know a trifecta is a bet that has three components. And you cannot win the bet if you don't hit on all three. If you only get two, you don't win. Right? So to get to critical hope, you got to do all three. The first of these is what we call material hope. And this is first and foremost just understanding that providing quality resources, whether you're a teacher, a social worker, a counselor, whatever, providing high quality resources to kids is a huge material resource in our communities, where so many of the institutions are under-resourced, underfunded, and highly dysfunctional. So what you do as an individual matters. Be badass at whatever you do. And that alone is a massive resource in our community. But that won't be enough. You're going to have to find ways to supplement all those things that you are offering with all those other things that kids need that you're not offering. And this is why partnerships are so important. Really figuring out what are the kids that I'm working to serve need, how many of those things are in my wheelhouse, and let me make sure that they are getting high quality services in my wheelhouse. And then let me start partnering and directly connecting them with people that can handle some of the other wheelhouses that aren't in my specialty. That's a full service provider. But if kids get what they need from you, but then have 9 other needs, and those don't get met, the impact of your resources is dramatically reduced. When we are able to do this, to materially resource kids, we close the gap between their most pressing needs and what we actually offer them in our schools and our broader set of youth-serving institutions. Here's the part that pisses me off about this. We've known this since 1943. This is not new. And in my field in education, they are constantly talking about being data-driven. But the problem with being data-driven is that if you look at all the wrong data, you're just driving off the cliff. I don't have any problems with being data-driven. But let's be driven by the data that is actually supported by 60-plus years of science, 60-plus years of research across fields agrees that Maslow was right. Public health, social epidemiology, neuroscience, child development, all agree Maslow's right. And there it is. Now, what's interesting to me about Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the pinnacle. Self-actualization. Here's what the medical research says. The natural human condition is self-actualization. That is the natural human condition. And the most successful young people self-actualize, don't they? The most successful kids in my class, I said, okay, tonight you got to read chapter 1 and 2. We're starting this book off. Boom, read chapter 1 and 2. And the most successful kids come back the next day and be like, yo, I read the whole thing. Chapter 1 and 2, boring as hell. The end, dope. Can we talk about the end? That's what we want from kids. We want kids who go beyond our expectations. That is self-actualization. Well, Maslow's research clearly delineates the pathway to self-actualization. The first and most important thing for you to understand is that is the natural human condition for the kids. Which means that if they are not self-actualized, there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them. Kids are not broken. All that means is something unnatural, back to the research, unnatural causes. Something unnatural is blocking them from being who they really are. Okay? So our job is not to fix kids. Our job is to clear the things out of the way that are getting in the way of being who they naturally are. And Maslow's clear about what those things are. The kids that are not self-actualizing have esteem issues. They've been taught to hate themselves. They've been taught to hate their skin color, their hair texture, the language that they speak, the countries that they come from, the neighborhoods where they live, their own families, their own parents, their own brothers and sisters. And when you have that much self-hate, when you have that much self-doubt, the likelihood that you engage in risk behavior, self-destructive behavior, radically escalates. And if you have self-esteem issues, it is almost certain that you are participating in institutions where you do not feel loved and you do not feel a sense of belonging. And if you are participating in those kind of institutions, it is almost certain that one, if not multiple, of your 4 basic needs are under threat: food, clothing, shelter, safety. Okay? Maslow's pathway is clear. Start at the bottom, work up. That right there is your formula for creating healthy lives in your young people. Right? Stabilize basic resources. Create places where they feel loved and a sense of belonging. Teach them to love themselves. Teach them their own history. Teach them to value their culture. And the rest takes care of itself. Right? The science is clear. Second is what we call Socratic hope. This is a term I borrow from Cornel West, who talks about a Socratic sensibility. Cornel West says that young people don't want to hear a sermon, they want to see one. Adults in the lives of high-needs youth tend to be quick to sermonize. Right? We got all kinds of answers that we can run off of the mouth about. But what young people are most profoundly impacted by is how we actually live our lives. And those of you that are parents in this room already know that. Kids learn way more from watching us do things than from listening to us tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And for me, this is the gap between being loved or being liked. So many people that are doing this work in our communities are outsiders to our community. And they know they're outsiders. And so they play the role. And when you are an outsider in a community, you become like Switzerland. You just try to keep it cool with everybody. Okay? You don't want any beef, no conflict. And the problem with that is that people in the lives of the most vulnerable youth that aim to be liked are never loved. And the people that fundamentally change the lives of the nation's most vulnerable youth are the people that those youth love. But the problem with love in this country is that we are profoundly Pollyannish about it. We talk about love like it's The Notebook. Y'all seen The Notebook? Ridiculous, right? That it all ends with us, okay, 60 plus years in blissful marriage, and we die together in our bed peacefully with our arms around each other. Okay? That's some shit. I don't like The Notebook one bit. My wife makes me watch it. That's a lie too. That's kind of a cool movie. But that ain't love. And we embrace, okay, this Hollywood notion of love, that love is the absence of conflict. And so when conflict emerges its ugly head, we think, oh, this is not a loving relationship. Love is not the absence of conflict. Love is the presence of conflict with the courage, the character, and the commitment to find your way through. That's love. That's what kids are looking for. They know there's going to be conflict. They know there's going to be beef. What they're looking at is, how do you respond when there is? Will you battle for my heart? Because Sony will, and Xbox will. They'll battle. They'll invest in me. Will you invest in me? And you don't got the money that Xbox has. You don't got the money that Sony has. So you better beat them with heart. Because they ain't got no heart. They're not invested in our kids here. They're invested in our kids here. And the pathway to the head is through the heart. And we can always win that one, but we're losing. We're losing to these corporations. We're losing to these external interests in kids' lives because we've lost track, okay, of the value of the heart, and the importance of loving our youth unconditionally. That is what Tupac talked about. Unconditional love. No matter what you're going through, I see you. And I'm going to love you anyway because I've been through it too. That's the challenge. That is the single greatest risk behavior a human being can engage in. Unconditional love. Because there is no guarantee of safety. And I promise you this, if you love kids in this way, you will get your heart stomped out.
Yeah.
You will go to funerals. You will bury children. And it will crush you. And then you will find a way, as Socrates said, to get back up and do it again. And that is the kid, or excuse me, that is the adult that kids will run through walls for. And that, y'all, is why teachers drink. Third, in critical hope is what I call audacious hope. Okay? And Lisa Delpit says it best in her book, Other People's Children. Right? She says, too many people working with young people in our communities see them as other people's children. And other people's children can fail. Other people's children can go to probation. Sorry, they left. Other people's children, not surprising, can need some tough love. Other people's children can be suspended. Other people's children can be expelled. But what about your son? What about your daughter? How many levers would you pull to find a way if it wasn't working? That's the challenge, right? Can we see other people's children as our children? The way that we try to do this is by understanding our sphere of influence. Right? The material conditions that I've laid out, the material conditions that are affecting the communities that you serve, they're real. Okay? You are not going to end poverty today. You're not going to end racism today. You're not going to end xenophobia today. You're not going to end patriarchy today. You're not going to end homophobia today. You're not going to end any of that today. Those things are going to be real in the lives of the children you serve. So what you got to figure out is, how do you dig where you stand? How do you impact the soil that you have real control over? Because that soil can be healing for the toxicity that kids are carrying with them. The best description I've heard this actually comes from a medical doctor, a woman named Camera Jones, who's on the teaching faculty at Columbia University in New York. And she wrote an article for a medical journal called The Gardener's Tale. And she tells this story about how she had just been hired at Columbia, and her husband bought a brownstone. And they're walking up the stairs to the house, and they get to the door, and she looks to the right of the door, and there's a window there with the flower box sitting underneath it. And she turns to her husband and says, that should be our first project, because that is going to be the first thing that people see when they come visit us. And her husband, like any smart partner, says back,
Okay.
yes, dear. Brilliant idea. I should have come up with that myself, but you're such a fast thinker, you got out ahead of me. So that weekend, they go to the gardening store. She buys a bag of soil. She buys a packet of flower seeds. She comes back and she's getting ready to put the soil into the flower box, and as she leans in, she realizes there's a partition splitting it in half. And on one side, it's empty, but on the other side, there's already soil. So she takes the fresh soil and she just puts it in the empty side. And she takes the flower packet, splits it in half, kneads half the seeds into one side and half the seeds into the other. And she says over the next several weeks and months, she's paid particular attention to make sure that both sides got plenty of light, plenty of water. And she says what happens next was the most important medical discovery of her career. On the side with the fresh soil, all the flower seeds grew. Full height, vibrant colors, and they made room for each other in the box. But on the other side, she said she began to realize that that soil was old, and it was devoid of some key nutrients, and it was rocky. And on that side, only a few of the seeds grew, and they only grew to middling height, and they crowded each other in the box for the few resources that were available. And she said, what I realized in that moment is how much place matters. And that is how much you matter. Because you control the place where you do your work with those young people. And so it is our responsibility as gardeners trying to grow these roses out of the concrete to change the soil where we stand. Now, in 21 years in the classroom in East Oakland, I have never had a perfect year. I have never had a perfect semester. I have never had a perfect marking period. I have never had a perfect month. I have never had a perfect week. I have never had a perfect day. And I have never had a perfect class period, ever, in 21 years. But I wake up every day expecting to, knowing that I won't. And to do that, you've got to be audacious. But in this field, audacity is punished. In this field, you are encouraged to be conservative. You are encouraged to follow the party line. And what I am saying is, how's that going for us? It is time that those of us that are committed to the lives of the nation's most vulnerable youth begin to innovate. Begin to think about what it means for us to take greater risks in the interest of the lives of young people who are taking incredible risks just to get to us. We have to match the courage of the young people, and the problem in this society that we are grappling with right now is the young people often show more courage than the grown folks. And that is what Eduardo Galeano called a society upside down. And that goes a long way to explain what we are finding in the health outcomes in this society. This is the least healthy society in the industrialized world. We're doing the worst. And you look at the lives of young people, and there's some pretty clear explanations about why. The response, not as complicated as you might think. I'm going to end with a very grounded example from Maya's life. And I'm going to play a clip for you from an interview she did with Dave Chappelle that is the best example that I've seen of what it is that I mean when I talk about critical hope. And when I think about critical hope, I think about what my colleague Sean Jenright, who wrote this book next to the picture of Maya, Black Youth Rising, calls radical healing.